Ambrose Bierce is one of the three writers we're studying this week as part of our week devoted to Civil War fiction. Bierce is one of two authors this week who served in the war and is perhaps the only one who saw some real combat. He was born in 1842 in Indiana and lived until 1914, we think. We'll talk about the end of his life here in a minute. This is a picture of him as an officer in the Union Army during the Civil War. And when I say Union, I also mean federal, which is the term that Bierce uses in Occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge. And this is a photograph of Bierce taken later in life. Bierce is normally seen as kind of a second-tier author. He's not as famous as Mark Twain. He's not as famous as Henry James or Walt Whitman or Emily Dickinson. We don't tend to see him normally at that in that company. However, he's a remarkably intriguing writer whose stories, from my perspective, seem to have grown in their ability to surprise us and engage us over the 100 or so years that they've been around. As I said, he was in the Union Army. He joined it early. He joined the Indiana Volunteer Regiment. And then later, in 1863, after 2 years of service as an enlisted soldier, moved up to a general's staff. He became an engineer and a map maker. Which is how he spent a great deal of the rest of the war. He was wounded. He received a brain injury at Kennesaw Mountain, a battle near in Georgia, in 1864. And he left the Army for almost a year at that point because he was injured so profoundly. People were concerned that he wouldn't live. But he did come back after a few months in that period of time for a short period. Then he went back out as an invalid. And then in 1866, he rejoined the Army, this time as a captain and as a map maker, and went on an expedition from the east to the west. And he ended up in San Francisco. That's where the expedition ended. They were doing map making in the American West after the Civil War. He left the Army as a major. So he had an unusual career for a writer in that he had all this military experience. Well, in San Francisco, he turned his hand to journalism, and he became a newspaper editor and a writer, a satirist, a short story writer for most of the rest of his life. But most of his work was newspaper work. He was a reporter, a columnist, an essayist, back when newspapers published a little bit more than just the news. Okay. There was a period in his life relatively late, in the late 1880s, early 1890s, when he wrote most of his short stories, and most of these were Civil War related. The book that came out in 1891, Tales of Soldiers and Civilians, and this is the cover here, or the front of this page rather, was published in 1891 in San Francisco. And this contains many of his Civil War stories, including an occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge. Another thing that he's noted for was a later book called The Devil's Dictionary, and it started off as a cynic's word book. Bierce was a sort of a man who was always unhappy. He was always uncomfortable. He was married. I honestly don't remember if he and his wife had any children, and they had a reasonably happy marriage. But Bierce himself was always a man who was unhappy with conventional society. And if you read any of his newspaper reporting, you'll see him skewering sort of the values, the shibboleths, the customs of the society in which he lived. What many people find interesting about him is nobody's sure when he died. When he was 71, he left San Francisco and went to Mexico to supposedly fight on the side of Pancho Villa, who at this time was trying to overthrow the dictatorial government that existed in Mexico. And Pancho Villa was trying to establish a populist government. And of course, you may know the story that Pancho Villa invaded the United States very shortly, for a very short period of time in New Mexico and Texas. And there was what was called the 1914 Punitive Expedition, where Army, cavalry, and infantry and Marines, U.S. Marines, went down to Texas and New Mexico to fortify the border and to chase Pancho Villa back into Mexico. My grandfather, who was a Marine for 40 years, from 1905 to 1945, was part of that expedition as an enlisted man. Or no, I'm sorry, at that point he was a warrant officer. Um, so anyway, Bierce went to fight on the side of Pancho Villa, which most Americans would never have done because they would have thought Villa was a radical. However, nobody knows what happens to him. They don't know if he died. They don't know if he was killed. They don't know if he never got to Mexico and died after he left. San Antonio is kind of the last place where people know he was, where he met with some cavalry officers that he knew. What I find interesting about this is this was not a young man's fancy. He was 71. And in 1914, if you were 71, you were really old. I mean, I'll be 70 this summer, for instance, and I don't think of myself as being like at the end of my life, but not yet anyway. But for someone in 1914, 70 was like you lived beyond what people expected you to live. So I think it's extraordinary that he went to Mexico to fight another battle, and I think that tells you a lot about his character. An occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge is the most famous Bierce story. It appeared in 1890 in the San Francisco Examiner in a newspaper that, by the way, is still being published. And it's an interesting story because it shows the utter ruthlessness that prevailed on both sides. We see a Southern planter, Peyton Farquhar, who decides that he's going to go leave his plantation, leave his slaves, leave his family, and go try to set fire to a bridge that covers Owl Creek. And this is to break up a Union supply line. He makes the mistake of telling who he thinks is a Confederate, but is actually a Federal or a Union spy, that this is his intention. And so he tries to carry it out. And of course, the story doesn't tell you this, but you see it because of the way the story begins with the hanging, the setup for the hanging of Peyton, that he's caught and that he's discovered in this process and that he's summarily executed. Okay, so what's interesting about the story is how detailed and precise and slowly and carefully and formally it moves. The Federal soldiers are like, I don't want to say robots or automatons, but they act according to a script, and their movements are described precisely, what they're wearing, how they're carrying their weapons, where they're standing, what exactly happens. You get the sense that all this is going on in real time. And then the story splits just at the moment where the hanging begins. And we see what goes on inside Peyton's head, and then we see what really happens. And for those of you who haven't read the story, I won't spoil it, but there's basically two different narratives. And the story ends in kind of a surprise because we're not really prepared for the actual ending that we get. Okay. What I find interesting about this story and what elevates it above just a conventional narrative of a hanging is the fact that we're in the middle of a river. We're on a bridge. We're sort of in between things. There's land on both sides. One side is barricaded by the Union. One side apparently must be open to people coming up to it because Peyton's able to get there. It's as if this bridge kind of marks north and south. And in the middle of it, in the exact middle of the bridge, that's where the hanging occurs. And you have the Union officer, the Union soldiers on one side, and Peyton, a Southerner, on the other. And so we have this in-between kind of state. And I think what that does is supports the idea that there could be multiple endings, that there could be multiple possibilities. But of course, we know from the very ending of the story that that's not exactly what happens. It's interesting, too, because Peyton, as a character, is the only person who's named. Everybody else is just a uniformed person. They're a sergeant, a captain, the privates, the soldiers. Nobody else has a name, but Peyton does. Even Peyton's wife is not named. His children are not named. I don't even think his plantation is named. But Peyton has stayed out of the war. He's been a supporter, but he's stayed away from it until he gets this chance to do what he thinks is something heroic. In this regard, he's not unlike George in Editha, in that he is called to action and he chooses to answer that call in an interesting kind of way because he doesn't have to do this. He's not forced into it. Nobody literally, holds a gun to his head or anything. He chooses. He makes this choice. For the soldiers, I suppose they have a choice as well. They could capture him, make him a prisoner, bring him somewhere else, but instead they decide to hold a trial right there, right at this moment. Some of this comes from the conventional wisdom at the period that if you were in civilian clothes and you were in enemy lines, that you were a spy. And certainly that's the reason I think that this execution, this hanging, is put together, because the Federals assumed that Peyton is a spy. Okay, and so he's not protected by the normal sort of quote unquote laws of war this period of time. So again, the story to me is just fascinating. And Bierce, as I said, is always normally seen as kind of a second-tier writer. But this shows just what an extraordinary aesthetic imagination he has. And the story raises, as I've said before, a variety of complicated moral questions that have to do with what exactly we as human beings should use as a guide to our own actions. So I'll be interested to see again what you do with this in the discussion board if you choose to talk about it.